And I think what I'd like to remind us of as we start is that every 2 years we get a new Congress, as you know, and every 4 years we get usually a new administration, a new president, an executive branch, not always, but almost always. And whenever those two things happen, this particular week in general is one in which there's a lot of speculation. Since the election and even since yesterday, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot we don't know. And I want to stress that because usually before the election and between the election and when the Congress began and yesterday's inauguration, people spoke up a lot. People speculated, they promised, they refused. But we really have to kind of hang on and wait and see. So much has happened since yesterday that we begin to see what happens when the picture will take shape and we can track as we go, not just to what people are saying, but what is actually happening. I'm going to go over, I think, what we might call a big picture of the new Congress, the Congress that just left, the new administration, what we can expect, what the outlook looks like for the year. And that will kind of be in a contextual way. And then my good friend Daniel Haynes, you're in for a treat, is going to, from NAEYC, is going to join you in a little bit this afternoon. And Daniel's going to really dig into some of the specific programs that are so important to all of us. So we decided I would start with the context and then Daniel's going to dig in. So I'm going to go ahead and get started right away because I know we have limited time. We are going to leave the real world. Some of you have seen this slide before, I know, and hang out a little bit in Washington, D.C., which for the most part, we all agree probably isn't the real world. So let's look at what January looks like in the town right outside or inside the town that I live near. The 118th Congress adjourned. It's a particularly busy January, even busier than it usually is. And the new Congress, which is the 119th Congress, convened on January 3rd. The members were sworn in, they elected their leadership, and they've already begun work. Bills have been passed, hearings have been held, so they did not waste any time. And then right in the middle of all of that, President Carter's funeral was held here in Washington at the National Cathedral on January 9th. And as part of that, you saw the Capitol yesterday when the president was inaugurated. President Carter's remains lied in state right in the Capitol for over 24 hours. People came and visited, waited on long lines, and then his funeral occurred at the National Cathedral. And then, of course, he flew home to Georgia, where he went from his home state. And then just yesterday, we had an inauguration, and President Trump was inaugurated for his second term. And it also was, not coincidentally, Martin Luther King Day. So lots and lots of things were going on. The big thing about yesterday that everybody was waiting for, and if you're paying attention, you've been watching it all day today and all last evening, was the first thing that happens after an inauguration is the new president signs executive orders. Now that's kind of a new phenomena. Up until the last one or two inaugurations, nobody was looking especially urgently at what the executive orders would look like. But if you go today, and some of you probably have already done this, go to whitehouse.gov and you will see all of the executive orders that have already been issued. When I checked a little bit, maybe an hour ago, there's about 50 already up there, but we know he signed over 100 already, the new president. So keep watching because that's going to be impacting a lot of things that are important to us. So why don't we look at some of the highlight things? I know one thing that we're, of course, interested in is funding. And the continuing resolution is what's funding us now. You may or may not remember that every year when we get to September 30th, we're always in a position where the Congress hasn't reached agreement on what every program should be funded at. And so in order to keep the government open, and there's always threats, are we going to shut down the government, or are they going to finish the funding process? Or what usually happens almost every year is they pass what's called the continuing resolution, which we refer to fondly as a CR. Some people look at it as, which makes sense to me, that it's kicking the can on down the road, because really what it means is the Congress and the White House are saying, we can't come to agreement. We tried, we can't, we need more time. And so the Congress that just adjourned January 3rd 118th Congress. They reached agreement. They had a December 20th deadline. They're big. All Congresses are big on giving themselves deadlines right before important breaks, so that it adds more pressure, gives them a tougher time. Like, make it harder for me, make it harder, and they still struggle with coming to consensus. December 20th was the deadline, and right before that, they agreed to another CR extension. This one goes till March 14th, and the significance with this one is it's now going to be dealt with by the new Congress and the new White House. If it had been December 20th, it would have been past President Biden and the previous Congress. So it's now in a whole new political ballgame, if you will. Included in that, and it was basically it's a freeze. So everything, if you think of what your programs are funded at, the last year's 2020, that should be 2024 levels. This year's funding right now is frozen at last year's levels. Also included in that was an additional $100 billion in aid for communities impacted by natural disasters. Of course, couldn't be more important to your state at the moment. And that included $500 million for child care providers. Now, agreement needs to be reached before this March deadline. It will be funding the year that started last October 1, or they're going to have to pass another CR. But by the time we get to March, the year is half over. That's when we did the agreement last year. They funded 2024 last year in March. And so we'll see. Hopefully they'll be able to. But what's important for you to know is, as far as Part C and preschool special ed and special ed state grants, those monies that they're working on right now are allocated to all states, including California, with your award for those programs this July 2025. Regardless of when we finish that funding for 2025, 2026 is still going to come. The calendar's still moving. That begins October 1 of 2025, coming up. And that budget work will begin when President Trump presents his budget to the Congress. We could expect somewhere March, April, we don't know exactly when, but once the president puts his budget into the mix on the table, then the Congress begins, and that's when they have to begin their work. So not unusual. We're dealing with we'll be working on 2 years of funding at the same time. And I think you've already heard, we don't know what we're going to get, but do not expect increases. As a matter of fact, this is one of those years where you probably will be very lucky if we're frozen again. There's talk about significant cuts, and we probably just have to keep that in mind. So looking at the new administration, President Trump was inaugurated. They moved the activities into the Capitol Dome due to the extreme cold. That doesn't happen very often, but it does happen occasionally. Numerous executive orders were issued, and we expect that will keep unrolling the rest of this week for sure. And some of those orders will be actually ones that are rescinding the orders from President Biden. And so sometimes they're brand new orders, and you can see them, as I said, if you go onto the website today. Transition recommendations are occurring. I have visions, if you think of paper, not computers, I have visions of some room in some building where all the transition recommendations that the new administration is getting are piled up on desks. And I wonder if anybody's really going to be able to take the time to read them. But every new administration yields what we call transition recommendations. And think of all of the associations. If you look at just the early childhood and education associations, there's maybe 150, 200 of them. And that's just our little corner of the world. There's many, hundreds of more. And so every one of them, when the new administration comes to town, sends a set of recommendations. The groups you might be most familiar with are DEC and ITCA, which is the Part C Directors Association. They're both submitting recommendations, and they'll be on their web pages. And then there was one that was a joint early childhood letter. It was signed by 78 national and state groups. And the important thing, which is why I brought it to your attention today, and the link is right at the bottom of the slide, and you'll be able to get the slides, of course, is that 78 groups signed it. But more importantly, it includes direct references to the importance of Part C and preschool special ed as part of the making sure birth to 5 opportunities are there for children. So no matter what setting they're in, Head Start, childcare, pre-K, or for some children, services at home, the services and supports they need to further their development are made available. So that's the administration. Now let's move to the Senate. The new Senate has, and I'm going to speak, even though this is totally nonpartisan, we're going to speak about parties with regard to who makes the rules and who has the majority, because that really dictates the agenda as they're set, the numbers of people involved, and how easy or hard it is to get anything to really happen. So the Senate has a Republican majority. That was a switch from the last Congress. But look how small the margin is. It's 53 to 47. There are 12 new senators. John Thune from South Dakota was chosen by the membership as the new majority leader. So he replaced Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, who's still in the Senate, but he's no longer the majority leader. He stepped aside. And Charles Schumer, or Chuck Schumer from New York, is the minority leader, and he had been the majority leader when the Senate was under Democratic rule. Leader Thune announced immediately, and you can already see it happening, that his 2025 calendar will be much more rigorous than the previous calendars. He announced we will be in session on Fridays. Typically they were not. They would fly home or drive home and go to their home districts and their families every weekend. They may still do that, but they're going to be in session on Fridays. And he also announced there'd be no recesses at all for the first 10 weeks. And that is completely unusual. A couple of mention on committees that are important to us. Again, big contextual things. The Health Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, is the committee that has responsibility for IDEA. It also has responsibility for Head Start, child care, pre-K, and health programs. So it's really important to us. Senator Cassidy from Louisiana is now the new chair, because the chair now is a Republican. That's how the process works. And Bernie Sanders, who had been the chair, is now the ranking member. The Health Committee has jurisdiction, as I said, over IDEA. Keep in mind, you always consider what the chair's priorities are. And Senator Cassidy has made it clear for years that one of his major priorities is dyslexia, and he's particularly interested in including it in the IDEA statute as a separate eligibility category. Now that causes you to wonder, does that mean we're going to open IDEA up? It's not a guarantee we would, but we all get real nervous if anybody opens the statute up, because often it's kind of like a Pandora's box once it opens. But we'll see. But know that that's a big priority of his. Let's move over to the House for just a minute. Now, the House majority was with the Republicans last Congress, and it remains there. But what changed was the majority, the margin got much smaller. It's 217 to 215. And one of the reasons it's so tight is because the number of members who were Republicans were nominated by the president to be in the cabinet. And so they've left their seat. And so the majority is much, much smaller. And really what it means is your party's got to stay tight. The caucus has to be lockstep, or you're not going to be able to pass anything. There are 63 new House members. And so, of course, DEC would recommend from an advocacy standpoint that everybody introduce themselves to their new House members, to their new senators if they have them, and begin to form relationships and tell them the stories about the important work that you do. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, was reelected. He was the Speaker at the end of the last session from Louisiana. And Hakeem Jeffries from New York is the Democratic leader of the House, again, because the Democrats are not in charge of the House, but they have a leader as well. And so Mike Johnson and Hakeem Jeffries will work very closely together. And they already do. They appear to have a really good working relationship. In the House, bills are passed by a simple majority. So if Mike Johnson can keep his caucus together, he can pass whatever he wants. But if he loses any of his members, he's in a position where sometimes he's got to get members from the Democratic side to pass something. What's important to mention here, and it's about the Senate, is unlike the House with a simple majority, the Senate for almost every bill needs 60 votes. And you saw they did not have that margin at all. So it's very difficult to get things through the Senate. easy to get things through the House, but the margin is small in the House, so we'll see. Tim Walberg from Michigan has been appointed as the chair of the House Education and Workforce Committee, and Bobby Scott from my state of Virginia is serving as the ranking member, and he was last Congress as well. So that's what the House looks like. But the House has been working since January 3rd. They did not go home for a recess before the inauguration. They went ahead and started working too, and they've passed 2 bills already, both of which are being actively considered by the Senate. And the bill related to immigration will probably pass the Senate. If it didn't last night, it's going to pass. But already a signed into law bill will be on our plates or in our hands long before the end of the week. And then the second bill would restrict any school who gets federal funding to allow transgender individuals to play girls or women's sports. So any school with any federal money would be restricted from allowing transgender individuals to play sports. So that's pretty serious. The Senate is also continuing it right now. Both bills are under consideration, but the first bill has already pretty much gone through. The House Budget Committee, now we have new information from the House Budget Committee in the last week, and they have plans, and they've made much of this public, to cut over $5 trillion over 10 years. And if you know much about the pie of the budget of the country, you know that very little of that pie, a very small slice, is what we call discretionary money. The Congress votes on it every year. The bulk of that pie is mandatory money, meaning they don't vote on it. It's by statute. Medicare, Medicaid, TANF, those programs, and Social Security, those programs, they spend as much as they need. They just are automatically spending, which means if you're going to cut $5 trillion, you either have to change the statute on those mandatory programs, or you have to cut it out of the smaller discretionary pot. And that's what the community is very worried about. What kind of cuts are we expected to see? What about all this money? Why do they want $5 trillion? Funds are needed to support the new priorities of the new administration. And that includes extending tax cuts, but it also includes priorities such as border immigration and border control. Those will be, according to the plans of the new administration, will be very expensive. And so funds would be needed. And in addition, they're needed to bring down the debt. Everyone agrees that. The thing to remember about these cuts is that the congressional action is needed to enact these cuts. It's not something anybody can do on their own, including the president. They use the term, and I know you've heard this many, many years, the first 100 days of the new administration or the first 100 days of the new Congress. That's considered a really active time, like we're going to do all this. You elected us, here we are, we're going to get a lot done. Look at the priorities and keep in mind some of them are things that can be done by executive order by the president, but most of them are things that will need to be done with the approval of the Congress. And you saw how hard it is for a Congress with these small political margins to pass anything. Immigration and border security, the one you hear probably the most about, and there already are executive orders issued that you can read that have been issued. Tax provisions from the taxes that were put in place the last administration, and these will expire by December, and so the president's intent is to get them continued. Significant cuts, as I said a minute ago, to domestic discretionary programs, which would include all the programs. I could name them all, but it's all the programs important in education, health, and early childhood. Medicaid changes. I'm going to talk a little more about those huge plans for cutting Medicaid. Medicaid is a mandatory program. If the statute's changed, it can yield lots and lots of savings, or as we would call them for Medicaid cuts. Another important topic for this president, and you've already seen it in some of the executive orders yesterday and today, is responding to diversity, equity, inclusion. It was extremely important, as you know, to the previous administration, but to this, and this president has plans and you'll see some of them in some of the executive orders already issued. Raising the debt ceiling on top of everything else, we've reached our debt ceiling again. That's the amount of money we can borrow. If you raise the debt ceiling, which we have to do, because if we don't do that, we can't pay our debt obligations. Raising the debt ceiling doesn't mean give us more money to spend. It allows us to pay the debt, pay the bills. Funding for natural disasters, particularly the fires in your wonderful state, energy and climate changes, and then changes to federal employee categories. President has already issued some of these plans this morning. Some of them will require working with the unions and some will not. And so there's lots that we can expect to see happening there. As I mentioned, the advocates are particularly worried about changes for Medicaid. This would result in savings. Some of the possibilities include creating a block grant, making it a per capita cap instead of these open-ended, we spend what we need, and equalizing federal payments for adults. So the optional program that California participates in, my state does, all but maybe 4 or 5 states do. It's optional, and adults without disabilities can apply and be part of Medicaid as long as your state allows it. And when they do, the federal match for adults is a lot higher, in the 90s. And so that would give, of course, if they change that match, states 10, federal 90, or whatever the current proportion is, and bring it more toward what most match is, which is somewhere 50-50, different in every state, that would save a lot of money for the federal government. But what would happen most likely then is some states would say, oh, now we can't afford to do it. So people are very worried about Medicaid changes. Other changes might be adding work requirements or changing eligibility requirements. So watch carefully. That will take congressional action as well. The president can't do that alone. He can do some of it, but not most of it. And then the other conversation, you may remember a couple of years ago, we had a regulation called Public Charge Rule that may be reinstated. That particular regulation allowed, it had calculations allowing entry to the United States to be refused when they looked at an immigrant status and they were trying to come to the country, see what if they were likely to require federal benefits once they landed in our country, in the United States, and would allow them to be refused entrance into the country. And that rule was taken away, and already there's discussion that the President Trump's administration may reinstate it. So I'm going to mention the Department of Ed because everybody talks about it, way back during the election, after the election, and even now, people talk from the administration side about eliminating the Department of Education. That is not a new conversation. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but I think I can probably say it's probably not going to happen. In the last Congress, Mike Rounds from South Dakota introduced a bill. It died in that every bill that doesn't get enacted and signed into law before the end of the Congress dies. The bill expires. Nothing to stop Senator Rounds from reintroducing it again in the new Congress. I should check. He might already have done it. His bill, as written, would eliminate the Department of Ed that was established in 1979. All the programs would move to other agencies. It wouldn't eliminate the programs. So IDEA under his bill would go to Health and Human Services, elementary, secondary education would go to Treasury. So they would just parse out the programs. This has happened before, and last time was 2023, and the bill was defeated with significant bipartisan votes. So the Department of Education bill has lots of support in both political parties. And there's something to be said when a new administration, a new Congress comes in, and they have a lot on their priority list, a lot. You wonder kind of what will get the most of their attention, and is this something they really want? The other thing to keep in mind is you can decimate a department by means other than eliminating it. You can drastically cut the federal program money in that department. We don't know if that will happen, but threats are there that it probably will, or at least there'll be strong attempts. We have a new committee. It's not official. It's kind of ad hoc. It's the DOGE committee. It's the Department of Governmental Efficiency. Already lawsuits have been filed since yesterday, and the president did issue an executive order establishing it. It's co-chaired by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Actually, Vivek Ramaswamy is set to resign from the group to run for the governor of Ohio, probably, if he hasn't already done it, sometime today or tomorrow. This group was charged, and they have staff already hired, charged with increasing government efficiency and identifying budget cuts. So the president said, I want a group of people I trust to go in and move around, look at things, analyze things, and go ahead and give me some recommendations. Now, this committee has no power except it will report to the president. And then the president certainly has power. Now, the president can't cut a program under most circumstances, but the Congress would have to be involved. But the Congress, House and Senate, and the president are the same political party. Again, the margins are small, but if the caucuses stay tight, except for the Senate, they should have a great ability to enact what they want. One possibility that's been mentioned, I don't think it'll happen. There's a Congressional Budget Office report. There's a rule that allows the government not to fund a program whose authorization has expired. According to CBO, there are hundreds of these programs, and they represent about $516 billion, which is why this provision appears attractive. It gets mentioned every couple of years. Nobody's ever done it. It would require congressional approval, but it puts us in danger from an IDEA standpoint, because while Part B, which includes preschool special ed, is permanently authorized and not in danger, Part C, birth to 3, and Part D, the support programs, are not permanently authorized. And the last time they were reauthorized was 2004, over 20 years ago. So they would be in jeopardy, but so would Head Start, child care, pre-K. A lot of hundreds of programs are not. So think about it. You'll hear if it's gonna, but I don't think it's probably likely from what I hear. Nobody knows for sure, because congressional approval would be required. Mention one other thing that's on their plate that they can use. There was you probably noticed or are implementing, August 21st, the new Head Start performance standards were issued, and there's a link to them right there. There's another provision that can operate called the Congressional Review Act, which allows regulations that have already been published in the Federal Register to be canceled by congressional action within 60 days of their publication. Now, that 60 days is publication, 60 congressional in-session days. So they're not in session 7 days a week or even 5 days a week. So they calculated, and for this year, or for this new administration, August 1 was the last date. So anything that was promulgated before August 1 is safe. It's protected under CRA, but whatever the last administration did. Anything after August 1 is subject to possibility, should be rescinded. And you can see when Head Start was published. So not saying it's going to happen, but it's eligible to be considered under CRA. So what can we really expect? We don't know way more than we know. Some priorities can be addressed with executive orders, as we said before. And so, read a couple of them and you'll see. Some of them are just renaming things. Some of them are very significant. Most of them, the priorities, will require consideration and agreement by the new Congress. Passage of any legislation will be difficult, as I've said a number of times, particularly in the Senate. For most bills, they need 60. I want to just focus your attention just a moment on something you hear. If you listen to the news, you'll hear the term reconciliation process. The Senate has a special rule called reconciliation. What it allows them to do is to pass something in the Senate by a simple majority. So that means if they want to get something through, they probably want to use reconciliation. Right now, there are two possibilities being debated and discussed by the White House and the Congress. A bill needs to meet the test of reconciliation, which means it must be related to money, either finance, taxes, revenues. So, but it has to meet the test, and things in there have to meet that test. They can do it probably twice this year. One possibility is to do what someone referred to as a big, beautiful bill with everything they want to do in it. And then, or a second choice would be two smaller reconciliation bills, one of which would occur in the first 100 days and another much later in this first session of the Congress. But imagine the things that would be considered to put in there. Things like debt ceiling extension, and they could put the budget for 2025. They could put the tax extensions. Lots of things could be rolled up in there. Here's a list of the programs that we relate to that are all overdue. They're all in the queue and they're not moving. And these are ones that would be subject to that concern about being funded. But we'll see what the new congressional committee chairs have in mind for some of these programs. Just a reminder, some of you really like to track all this like I do, and I know you do because I know you watch C-SPAN. So if you're one of those people, congress.gov is a website to keep in your bookmarks because that's where you can track any bill that's been introduced from the last Congress too, as well as this new Congress. So if you hear a bill's been introduced, you can search for it. It gives you the text, the status, what committee it's at, what the amendments are. It's a great way to track legislation. I'm coming to the end here, and we can look and see if we have any questions, but I'm sure you all recognize this bill on Capitol Hill. Just a bill on Capitol Hill. I will not sing, you'll be glad to know, but we're hoping the bill gets a little spiffier and sits up straight and actually feels like things can get moving this year. And that's it. I'm going to take down the slides so we could do any questions if you like. Stop sharing. And am I okay on time? Did I go too
yes,
slowly?
Sharon, no, we have a few minutes for questions, so we'll go to 10:40 if that's okay with you for questions.
Yes.
A couple in the chat. So are either Huffman's bill, HR 4519, or Van Hollen's bill, S2217, both of which deal with IDEA, still under consideration?
I think you're referring to the full funding bills for Part B, I'm pretty sure. Or you could be that would be definitely. They have not been reintroduced yet, but I'm told there is a plan to reintroduce them again. And those bills are really important to the special ed community. Equally important would be the parallel bill, which is called Funding Early Childhood is the Right Idea. We're planning to get that one introduced again this year.
Thank you. And do you have any recommendations on what we can do to advocate for families we serve and love?
Anything to do, well, I'm going to say from my DEC standpoint, just be your wonderful advocacy self. Make relationships, form relationships with your House member and your two senators' offices and your state and local folks as well. Let them know who you are, what you do, how important our programs are. Tell them your story, send them pictures, thank them for what they do. Don't always ask them first for stuff, thank them first. So I think if you think that was the question, Dana, I think I've answered it.
Thank you. Someone said, I can speak for many people. Wow, I'm wondering what you hear California's governor is doing in the event that IDEA is gutted.
I have not heard anything. Well, because I don't think it's likely at all. I don't know of anybody trying to gut IDEA. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't people who wouldn't want to do it, but I hear no effort to gut IDEA. And some people linked the Department of Ed question with IDEA. And all it would do, that bill, is move IDEA into HHS. Wouldn't do anything to gut it. Now, if you guys know something I don't know, then it's good you're telling me, because we all have to get on top of it. But I don't know what your governor is planning, but again, maybe somebody could fill me in a little bit more on what this gutting of IDEA would be and what the governor's planning to do, what Governor Newsom's planning to do.
Michelle, I saw you pop up. Did you want to say anything regarding that?
I don't know what our governor is planning to do. Hi, Sharon. Michelle Rogers, I'm
Hi,
here.
Michelle.
And I have a recently elected son into the California Assembly, and I asked him this question as well. He said they have not heard anything, and he's pretty good about letting me know if there's something we should be watching. But the question that does keep coming across to Ida is, should we be focusing solely on state advocacy and not federal advocacy? Because many of our partners in the federal government are saying, our plan is to keep our heads down, try to go very quietly unnoticed for the next 2 years. And I'm not sure I think that's a great plan, but I'm curious about what you think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's good to talk to you, Michelle. Good to see you. Give my regards to your son. I
Yep.
think we're going to all be needed as advocates at the federal level to keep the cuts from occurring. There's a significant plan. You know, last year and the year before, the House was ready to cut from domestic programs. And the only reason they didn't do it was because the Senate said, no, you can't do that. We don't have the Senate necessarily saying that. But I think I'm fine keeping my head down. I'm not asking for any new things. But I know through the DEC transition, we're asking for, and through the Part C coordinators, adequate federal funding. And so we'll keep our heads really high and our voices really loud if anybody tries to cut the funding for those programs. So that would be the way I would see gutting them. And it's certainly possible, but I think that's where we really have to stay vigilant. And of course, you've got to stay vigilant at the state level. You really do. Everybody does. It's just hard to focus on both.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we've been looking for is just a little bit more background on some of our new leadership, especially at the federal level, in whatever their participation has been in early start, because many times, the children that we serve graduate out and never need anything else, but it's a really big impact on families. And so if we know who our champions are, who've had children in special ed or who've had children in early start, it's just really hard to know that information without going and meeting those folks. And so I think it's one of the things that I always say to people, go meet them, ask questions.
Oh yeah, tell your story, ask questions. And I think people, without messing up confidentiality, programs can use data, aggregate data, to demonstrate the value added of a program. And that's critically important as well. It's going to be an interesting, and I know your son said 2 years. The reason he said 2 instead of 4 for everybody else's benefit is because while the presidency is 4 years, this Congress is only 2 years. And so you could tell the morning after the election, everybody started the campaigning for the election in 2 years. Thanks, Michelle. Any other questions?
I think that's it, Sharon. I'm going to hand it back to Matt. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation with a lot of valuable information. So thanks again.
Thank you. Well, I enjoyed being here, and just wait till you hear Daniel's presentation. He'll be here soon. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. That was wonderful. As always, thanks for your participation and very timely.